Today we are going to be discussing the case of Clay versus the United States, also known as Ali versus the United States. It's a landmark case, obviously involving Muhammad Ali and his draft evasion. But we're going to start with the case information. We have the famous boxer Muhammad Ali, who was in fact the plaintiff in this case, born Cassius Clay, and the defendant, which is the U.S. government, and they had charged him with violation of the Selective Service Act. The case arose because Ali had refused to be inducted into the military during the Vietnam War, claiming consensus objector status. His legal fight would ultimately become one of the most significant moments in the intersection of law, civil rights, and freedom of speech. For the facts of our case, to understand the legal dispute, we first got to look at the events leading up to the case. In 1967, Muhammad Ali, heavyweight champion of the world boxer, was drafted into the U.S. Army to fight in the Vietnam War. However, Ali refused to serve, citing his religious beliefs as a member of the Nation of Islam. He claimed that as a Muslim, his faith forbade him from participating in a war that he saw unjust and morally wrong. Because of this, he was charged with draft evasion under the Selective Service Act, which requires men to serve in the military if they are called up for induction. Ali's refusal to service in the military was bold and a public stand, making his legal battle a high-profile issue. He was convicted in 1967, sentenced to 5 years in prison, and fined $10,000. On top of that, he was also stripped of his heavyweight title and his boxing license. Ali's legal team argued that he had acted on the basis of his deeply held religious beliefs, which should have entitled him to consensus objector status. Despite his conviction, he continued to publicly advocate for the rights of those who objected to the war, making him a symbol of resistance for many. For our issues of the case, the central legal issue was whether Muhammad Ali's refusal to be drafted violated the Selective Service Act, or whether his stance as a consensus objector was legally justified based on his religious beliefs. The case also raised questions about freedom of religion and speech under the First Amendment, and whether the government could compel an individual to serve in a war that conflicted with their religion. Essentially, the question was, should Ali be punished for his refusal to serve, or does the First Amendment protect his rights to follow his faith and speak out against the war? For our rule of law, the rule of law in this case is primarily centered on the interpretation of the Selective Service Act and the First Amendment rights of free exercise of religion and freedom of speech. Under the Selective Service Act, men who were drafted had to report for military duty unless they were granted a deferment or exemption, such as for religious reasons. The issue was whether Ali's beliefs qualified him for such an exemption. Additionally, the First Amendment provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This raised a constitutional question about whether the government could force someone to act against their religious beliefs by drafting them into military service. For the application, the case was ultimately brought before the U.S. Supreme Court, which was tasked with interpreting how these laws applied to Ali's situation. The court examined the facts of the case closely, and first, the justices acknowledged that Ali's religious beliefs were genuine and sincere. Ali had testified that he did not believe in fighting in wars because of his religious faith, specifically his beliefs as a member of the Nation of Islam. The court also noted that Ali's refusal to serve was not an act of political protest, but rather that religious conviction that we just talked about. Ali had not publicly stated opposition to the war on purely political grounds, but rather on the grounds of his religion. In applying the rule of law, the court distinguished Ali's case from other cases where individuals had avoided the draft for reasons unrelated to religion. The government's arguments that Ali's refusal to serve was simply a form of personal political resistance or a desire to avoid military service did not hold. The court reviewed how lower courts had failed to fully account for Ali's religious stance. In particular, the court found that the selective service system had not given proper consideration to Ali's claim for consensus objector status under the law. For our conclusion, in a unanimous decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Muhammad Ali, reversing his conviction for draft evasion. The court held that Ali's refusal to be inducted into the military was protected under the First Amendment because it was based on his religious beliefs. The court emphasized that the government had failed to provide sufficient evidence to show that Ali's religious beliefs were insincere or they did not qualify him for consensus objector status. Ali had the right to refuse military service without facing criminal penalties, as his actions were protected under his constitutional rights to freedom of religion. The ruling not only restored Ali's boxing career, but also had broader implications for the rights of consensus objectors. It underscored the principle that the government cannot compel individuals to act against their deeply held religious beliefs, particularly in matters of war. This decision was a victory for the protection of individual rights, demonstrating how legal and constitutional principles could be applied to safeguard freedom of conscience, particularly in the face of government power. The case of Clay versus the U.S. stands as a reminder of the importance of protecting individual rights, especially when they conflict with the governmental authority. Ali's courage in standing up for his beliefs, despite immense personal and professional cost, not only led to his acquittal, but also helped to further define the boundaries between state power and personal liberty in America. Now, if this case had been an individual less popular than Muhammad Ali, somebody more common perhaps, we don't know if it would have turned out the same way. All the public attraction to the case and these times of protest was probably very impactful in the overall outcome of the case.